Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I am going to be using the pine cone background stamp as well as the Merry Christmas stamp set, both by Simon Says Stamp. I'm taking a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and I'm just smearing some Tombow Mono multi glue on the back of it, letting that dry for a minute or two, and once that is dry, it becomes repositionable. That way, when I line everything up in my MISTI and stamp this stamp multiple times, my paper isn't shifting around. So I'm going to stamp with Fade Out ink by Ink on 3, which is a no-line coloring ink. It's perfect for no-line coloring. And normally I would only stamp this once, maybe twice, being it is a background stamp. But here I'm stamping it multiple times because the more you stamp it, the darker your lines will be, just like any other dye ink or hybrid ink. And I want my lines to be seen. Not necessarily where I'm going to be doing my coloring, but throughout the entire panel, I want the lines to be faint, but I want them to be visible. So I stamped this a total of 4 times. And then I am going to go ahead and adhere this to my card base now. Normally I do this last, but because I have that repositionable adhesive on the back, I like to turn my paper around as I'm coloring. So this kind of is annoying when it's sticky on the back. So this way, once it's on my card panel or card base rather, it won't get stuck to my work surface as I'm doing my coloring. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the coloring of the pine cones. I'm using some E50 markers, and I'm going to go right in with my darkest color and add my darkest areas. Now, I'm not going to show you all of the coloring here. Honestly, this card took me about 3 hours. And the video is like 10 minutes. So you're only going to see a glimpse of it, but it's more the idea of the card, not necessarily the card as a whole. So for my shadows, I'm using the E59, and I'm placing the shadows where one little piece, I guess, I don't know what it would be called, but a piece of the pine cone is coming from behind another. And also these areas are kind of folded over on themselves. So that would cast a shadow on itself where it's folded over. And that fold piece, I'm also adding some shading there, but I'm not going directly in with that darkest color. So you can still add shadows, but you can use your mid-tone colors for that. I originally just started with my lightest mid-tone for the shadowing, and it just wasn't dark enough. So I ended up adding a little tiny bit of the E57 for the shading of that little fold. And I liked that much better. Now, each of these little pieces of these pine cones are different sizes, but they're pretty much all the same shape. So I typically, when I do my no-line coloring, I typically start with one little section at a time. And as you do your coloring, you're going to become a lot more confident with the shapes of these objects, that by the end of it, I was pretty much coloring the whole pine cone all at one time, adding all of my darks, then all of my midtones all at once, because I was pretty confident with how these were illustrated and how they needed to be colored and shaded. Like I said, the pine cones took probably about 2 hours. I did take a couple of breaks here and there, but this card is definitely, especially with this stamp set, if you're doing the no-line coloring, just keep in mind that this is not going to be a quick card by any means. So like I said, I am not going to show you all of the coloring, but basically what I have in mind is that I'm going to stamp that large sentiment in the center, and the coloring or the colored areas are going to be around that sentiment. That's why I stamped multiple times, so that you can still see the lines of the images through the sentiment, but that area will not actually have any color to it. It will just have the outline of the images. So I'm just kind of going through, as you can kind of see, I'm just doing a whole lot of the same thing over and over and over. And it looks a little bit weird right now. And any coloring, but especially no-line coloring, is going to. No-line coloring tends to look bad before it looks good. So as you're coloring these itty-bitty pieces of the image, keep in mind that it's not really going to look right until the whole image is complete and everything kind of comes together. So just keep going. I know it's a little discouraging, and no-line coloring can be a little intimidating as well, but I promise you, once everything is complete and all of these little sections of this pine cone are all colored in, it will start to come together. So after I got about halfway done with this particular pine cone, I realized I didn't know how far I needed to color towards the center of the card base or card panel until I actually stamped my sentiment. So I'm going to bring out my mini Misty here. I'm going to line up my sentiment, this huge sentiment from Simon Says Stamp, right there in the center of my card panel. And this time around, I'm just going to stamp with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because this is a Copic safe ink. And in case I come too close to the sentiment, I don't have to worry about the sentiment, the black ink smearing. So I'm going to stamp this twice, but I'm not really worried about getting a great impression. Any kind of Copic safe ink is not going to give you the best impression, especially for a large sentiment like this. This is kind of just being used as a guide at this point. I'm keeping that stamp in my Misty so that I can restamp my sentiment once my coloring is complete. So I went ahead and colored all of the pine cones, and many hours later, you can see they're all completed, and I just kind of stopped as I got close to the sentiment. Now for the greenery, I'm using 3 different greens here, and I'm not too concerned about being perfect with this. Naturally, you can see the lines, but I'm coloring over most of the lines, adding a few little pieces here and there, and probably missing some as well. I'm going right in with that darkest color, that G99, and I'm pretty much just adding a little bit of shading to the base of each of these pine needles, blending that out a little bit with the G94, and then I'll finish off with the G43, and all I'm doing is one flick. I'm barely touching the tip of the marker to the paper. You can see that my marker is straight up and down, and that's how you're going to get into these little tiny areas. You're going to be able to make one straight line or curved line, whatever you want, but it's going to be a very thin line as long as you're keeping that marker straight up and down. Now there are a few stems, I guess you would call them, throughout the image. And I'm going to bring in some G20s for that. I'm going to just add a little bit of shading with the E29. And the highlight will be the the E25. So E29 and E25, not really worried about doing a whole lot of shading, but I didn't want to use the same exact brown as I used for the pine cones. I wanted a little bit of variation there, but they're close enough where they go together well. So you can see these pine needles or pine whatever are kind of all different shapes. They're kind of overlapping each other, and being they're just straight lines, it doesn't matter. I don't have to worry about shadows. You can pretty much put shadows wherever you want because it's just giving you a variation in color. It doesn't necessarily mean shadow and highlight for this particular items. And like I said, I'm just flicking that out with just that tip of my marker. And again, I did the same thing. I came very close to the sentiment, just being careful not to completely go over it. So I filled in the entire card panel same way with these same greens. And then I am going to restamp my sentiment and get a much better and more crisp impression, I should say. So I'm going to line that back up in my mini Misty. I still have that stamp there. And this time I'm going to stamp with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a pigment ink. It's a fast drying pigment ink, but it's still a pigment ink and it's not going to dry immediately. So be careful not to touch your panel for at least a minute or so. It dries pretty quick. And I must have had something on my stamp, probably a cat hair. And I have a little bit of a gap there on my T, so I'm just taking an EK Success Journaling pen and filling that in. You do not want to use a Copic marker here because this is not a Copic safe ink. Last, I added a little bit of shimmer to just the pine cones with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen. And that is it. That is the whole card for today. Thank you guys so much for stopping by. I'll leave all of the supplies listed in the description box below. Have a great day. Bye.